Woods looked around as he ate breakfast. Within clear view of the wells and less than a mile to the east were two rocky prominences rising a couple of 100 feet above the surrounding plain. These eventually came to be marked on maps as Pima Butte. To the west, between 2 and 3 miles away, lay a short, high, and steep-sided range, the Sierra Estrella. Northward, across the Gila, was a long, low-lying string of hills, later to be called South Mountains by residents of Phoenix, Arizona. Closer at hand, and a little downstream, thickets of mesquite and screw beans grew densely at the junction of the Gila and the north-running Santa Cruz River, although it was a rare occasion when the Santa Cruz flowed its way above ground to reach the bed of the Gila. For many miles to the south, the land was flat. Indeed, this part of the Sonoran Desert was typical of its other regions, a great plain covered with creosote, burr sage, salt bushes, and cactus. Trees marking the paths of the arroyos and rivers where these channeled gently into the soil, and level vastness interrupted by short, abrupt, and narrow mountain ranges and occasionally isolated volcanic hills. There were other people at the wells. This was the third trip from east to west for the mail line, and company employees, mules, and equipment had been stationed here for more than a month. Isaiah Woods sat down to rest beneath a large mesquite tree and to wait the arrival of a man whom he had assigned as station agent. Below the place he was sitting, a short way to the north, he noticed a bonfire, then another, and still another. The burning grass and limbs poured thick white smoke into the morning sky. Signal fires, he thought. But signaling what? No one at the wells seemed to know. Still more bonfires blazed, each 100 yards or more from the others. The sound of shouting voices came from the direction of the fires. In the early morning light and through the trees, people could be seen running. Then it became clear. The flames were leaping from the Maricopa's dome-shaped brush houses that had been set to the torch. The Maricopa's village had been attacked by other Indians and a battle was taking place. There was no sound of firearms. The weapons were clubs and bows and arrows. This was Indian versus Indian, and Woods and the others at the wells had a ringside seat. What you just heard was an eyewitness account of the event that would become known as the Battle of Pima Butte. Isaiah Woods was the general superintendent in carrying United States mail between San Antonio, Texas and San Diego, California. At a stop at the Maricopa Wells, he witnessed the battle firsthand. On the morning of the 1st of September, 1857, along the banks of the Gila River in what is now Arizona, a battle unfolded that few Americans have ever heard of. Yet it stands as one of the largest and bloodiest native versus native conflicts in North American history. There were no U.S. soldiers, no cavalry charges, no federal reports to immortalize it. Instead, this was a clash born from generations of rivalry, carried out in silence beyond the edges of American awareness. What began as a carefully planned raid would erupt into a desperate fight for survival near Pima Butte, ending not in a simple victory, but in near annihilation. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Before I get too far into this episode, I leaned heavily on the book, Massacre on the Gila, an account of the last major battle between American Indians by Clifton B. Craver and Bernard L. Fontana. This was an unbelievable wealth of information. It has accounts from all sides available, an eyewitness account, the quote, white man's account, the account from the natives involved. It is a great book and definitely worth the read. But the Battle of Pima Butte grew out of an older world of intertribal warfare in the deserts and river valleys of what is now Arizona, long before American officials, soldiers, or settlers took much notice of it. For generations, the Yuma, more properly the Quechan in modern usage, and the Maricopa had been enemies, and the hostility ran deep. Some accounts describe ritualized confrontations in earlier years, even meetings at Berdache Mountain, where warriors hurled insults before battle. By 1857, that old rivalry had not faded, it had sharpened. The Maricopa, themselves a composite people driven eastward over time from older homes along the lower Colorado, had settled near their allies the Pima along the Gila River. The Quechan and Mojave remained powerful river peoples to the west. Between them stood memory, revenge, and a long habit of war. In this long-standing tension stepped a Quechan leader remembered as Chief Francisco. An ambitious, newly elevated figure likely seeking to prove his authority through a successful war expedition. Among the human-speaking peoples, warfare carried deep cultural weight, tied to honor, reputation, and leadership. Rather than acting alone, Chief Francisco organized a multi-tribal force that included Quechans, Mojaves, Yavapais, and likely Tonto or other Western Apache allies. This kind of coalition suggests a level of planning and shared purpose beyond a typical raid, though later accounts hint that not all groups were equally committed once the situation began to turn. Estimates of the force vary widely. Wide accounts often inflated numbers into the hundreds or even thousands. Shocker. While indigenous traditions more plausibly place the attacking force somewhere between 100 and 300 warriors. Regardless of the exact figure, this was clearly a large, organized expedition by the standards of the region. The scale of the march itself reinforces that point. The coalition traveled roughly 160 miles across the Sonoran Desert on foot over 8 or 9 days, navigating one of the harshest environments in North America, where water sources were scarce and conditions unforgiving. By the time they reached the Maricopa settlements near Secate and Maricopa Wells at the end of August 1857, the warriors would have been physically exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and worn down. That long desert march matters because it shaped everything that followed, both the attackers' mindset and their mistakes. After traveling roughly 160 miles across unforgiving terrain, the Quechan-led force could not afford to fail. They were deep in enemy territory, far from water, and physically worn down. Turning back empty-handed was not just a disappointment, it was a blow to honor, leadership, and survival. That pressure made surprise absolutely essential. In most accounts, they achieved it. Arriving near the Maricopa settlement under cover of early morning or just before dawn, they caught people outside the village before any organized defense could form. Several indigenous traditions describe Maricopa women gathering mesquite beans when the attackers fell upon them. Most were killed immediately. One woman, however, was spared temporarily and forced to guide the warriors into the village, specifically to the home of her brother, a known Maricopa warrior. After she led them there, she too was killed, an act that underscores both the calculated nature of the attack and the brutality of intertribal warfare at the time. The targeted warrior, however, escaped, and that escape became a crucial turning point. What followed was chaos. The attackers surged into the village, killing those they encountered and setting the brush houses on fire, sending flames and smoke rising into the desert air. Families scattered in every direction. Women and children fled toward Pima Butte, a nearby landmark that would later give the battle its name, while others ran along the Gila River seeking safety or help. From a distance, observers would later describe the scene as one of panic. People running through trees, houses burning, and the sound of shouting carrying across the valley. For a brief moment, the attackers had done exactly what they intended. They had struck hard, fast, and with devastating effect. Here the accounts begin to diverge in detail, but not in general shape. Everyone agrees the attack initially succeeded. Fires rose from the Maricopa homes before dawn. Isaiah Woods, the man mentioned in the intro, saw the blaze and realized a major fight was underway. His report is one of the most important white eyewitness descriptions because he was actually there. He described burning huts, shouting, people running through the trees, and the terrifying realization that this was a major Indian versus Indian battle being fought with clubs, bows, arrows, and lances rather than firearms. One old Maricopa chief, nearly hysterical and speaking excellent Spanish, rode to the white men at the wells and begged them to help, but they refused. They wanted no part in the conflict and had no desire to make enemies of the Quechans, through whose country the overland route passed. The old man turned away in disgust and rode east to summon aid from the nearby Pimas, a far more numerous and powerful allied tribe. That little episode says a lot about the world around the battle. White observers were present, but only on the edges, and the fight itself remained entirely native. The attackers, meanwhile, appear to have made a mistake that doomed them. After the first blow landed, they lingered. Some accounts say they paused to loot corn, melons, beans, and stored food from the village. Others say they were simply too exhausted from the desert march and needed to eat and rest. Still others suggest that not all of the allies agreed on what to do next. There is a recurring pattern in the sources. The Apache, Yavapai, and at least some of the Mojaves began leaving the field after the decisive first blow, while the Quechans and a portion of the Mojaves remained behind in or near the burning village, convinced they had won enough, or perhaps savoring the victory. The attackers spent the night singing war songs, while a medicine man puffed smoke so their cause would find favor among their gods. A man named Quechan, a Maricopa man who was a child at the time of the battle, later remembered the invaders stopping at the first houses, collecting food, and remaining all morning. Even some of the Quechan and Mojave versions admit that hunger, thirst, and fatigue slowed the force and left them dangerously exposed. That pause allowed the Maricopas to do exactly what the invaders had hoped to prevent: send word up and down the river. Messengers raced to nearby Pima villages. Here, the scale again becomes hard to pin down. White reports often gave the defenders enormous numbers, sometimes 1,000 or 1,200 warriors, though these figures were probably exaggerations. Yet the underlying fact is clear. The Pimas greatly outnumbered the Maricopas, and the Maricopas were under their protection. Even if only a fraction of the Pima fighting men responded, the balance of power changed dramatically. Some came on foot, many came on horseback. Several sources also mention Papagos, and a few white versions even mention Mexicans, though these details are less certain than the central alliance of Pima and Maricopa. By late morning or midday, what had begun as a successful surprise raid had turned into a trap, closing around the Yuma raiders. But before we move on, one of the most striking differences between all the different accounts is whether the trap had been prepared in advance or formed on the fly. Some later white retellings and a few indigenous versions claimed that Cocopas had warned the Pimas and Maricopas beforehand, and that the defenders were waiting in ambush along the mesquite. Other accounts, especially those closest to the moment, strongly suggest the Maricopas had in fact been taken by surprise and only rallied after the first attack. Wood's Eyewitness report supports surprise rather than prearranged ambush. The most careful reading is probably that rumors or fears of an attack may have existed, but the actual blows still fell suddenly enough to burn houses and kill non-combatants before the defense organized. This is one of those places where the story is uncertain. The broad outline is solid, but the exact mechanics of the defenders' response remain somewhat uncertain. But once the Pima arrived, armed with rifles and on horse, the battle completely changed. What had began as a raid became a slaughter. The defenders formed in lines or a semicircle, depending on the account, and began to hem the attackers in from several sides. The Pima version says the Council of Pimas and Maricopas decided to keep the enemy from reaching the river for water, a devastating tactic in desert heat after a long march. Quechan, the Maricopa that was a child at the time of the battle, remembered the line of horsemen converging one by one until the attackers realized they were lost. White reports describe the same essential scene from farther away. Mounted Pimas and Maricopas racing in, the invaders beginning to give way, and survivors fleeing toward the mountains where horses could not follow. At close quarters, the fighting was brutal. Nearly every account, white and native alike, emphasizes hand-to-hand combat. One Quechan version preserved by Joe Homer says a Maricopa leader advanced and deliberately singled out a Yuma warrior from the line, then killed him with a spear before the wider melee began. Mojave tradition remembered the Quechans refusing to flee, standing packed together in a dense mass, and when charged trying to seize enemies and drag them inward to be hacked apart with knives. And yet another account says clubmen moved among the fallen, finishing the wounded. Even where details conflict, the tone does not. This was desperate, savage, intimate fighting. Men were not being shot down at long range. They were being crushed, stabbed, lanced, clubbed, and ridden over. The defenders also seem to have divided roles in a way that later storytellers remembered clearly. Several indigenous versions say the Maricopas were the ones most eager for direct revenge against the Quechans, while the Pimas, especially those on horseback and in some accounts armed with rifles, cut off escape routes and struck from mobility rather than from the center of the hand-to-hand fighting. Joe Homer's Quechan account explicitly says most of the close fighting was between Maricopa and Yuma, while the Pima horsemen and riflemen prevented retreat. That division makes sense. For the Maricopas, this was personal. They had been the direct target of the raid. Their homes were burning, their women had been killed, and their village had been struck down. The Pimas were indispensable allies, but the core of the battle seems to have belonged to the Maricopas. As for the Mojaves, Yavapais, and Apaches, Some say most of the Mojaves withdrew early and only a segment stayed to be destroyed with the Quechans. Others say Mojave losses were very heavy, with one tradition claiming 60 dead. Yavapai traditions tended to minimize their own casualties and stress confusion, panic, and ominous signs before the battle, such as a deer collapsing and a hawk falling dead as the warriors march, both taken as bad omens of an impending disaster. White reports and Mojave memories alike agree that Yavapai and Apache allies were present, but they do not appear to have shared fully in the annihilation that overtook the Quechan. The closer the story gets to the last stand, the more it becomes a story about the Quechans, with some Mojaves beside them, refusing to yield and being nearly wiped out. The casualties are among the hardest details to settle, but every version points to catastrophic for the attackers. Woods estimated 104 enemy dead and only 11 survivors. Other reports push the dead closer to 150 or 160. A letter from Fort Yuma said the Yumas lost between 60 and 70 fighting men, with their allies suffering proportionately. Mojave tradition claimed 80 of 82 Quechans were killed, with only 2 surviving. Some Maricopa and Pima versions went even farther and said only 1 escaped, or none at all, though those probably point to thoughts of total victory rather than literal counts. The safest conclusion is that the Quechan were virtually annihilated and that all or nearly all of the Mojaves who remained beside them were also killed. Chief Francisco himself died there. The most commonly repeated story on the indigenous side is that they let 4 Yumas live so they can return back to their village and tell of the slaughter that took place. On the winning side, losses are much murkier. White newspapers reported perhaps 17 to 25 dead among the defenders. Some later accounts absurdly claimed no fatalities at all among the Pima and Maricopa. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it is with most cases. After the fight, the field was left covered with bodies. One account says the slain lay in piles where they had fallen, while trying to run for the mountains. Another says the corpse remained where they dropped, around 160 of them. Several reports emphasize that the Pima and Maricopa did not practice scalping in the way some outsiders expected, but instead took only a lock of hair from those killed. At Fort Yuma, the people heard the news and entered mourning. One version says all the Yumas around the post were grieving. Lieutenant Joseph Ives later wrote that the moral effect lingered long afterward, and that the very names of Pima and Maricopa inspired dread and humiliation among the Yumas and Mojaves. Some historians have argued that the engagement should be remembered not just as a battle, but as a massacre. It began as a raid and developed into a fight, but the end was profoundly one-sided. Once the attackers were fixed in place, surrounded, cut off from water, and overrun by superior numbers, many of them mounted, the outcome ceased to be a contest between roughly balanced forces. The Quechan war party did not simply lose, it was broken apart and destroyed, almost to the last man. Historically, the battle matters for several reasons. It is often called the last major battle fought exclusively between Native American forces in North America, or at least the last of that scale in the Southwest, before later conflicts became entangled with US expansion and military power. It was also one of the bloodiest intertribal battles ever recorded in the region, yet it remains strangely obscure. The reason is almost built into the event itself. No US troops fought in it. No white community was directly threatened by it, and very few non-Indians witnessed it closely enough to leave detailed records. Most of the contemporary written accounts are brief, sometimes only a paragraph or two, and even those frequently garble who fought whom. One newspaper initially made it sound like a 3-sided war. Another nearly wrote the Maricopas out of their own battle and turned it into a Pima story. That is why the later indigenous traditions matter so much. Without them, the event would survive only as a few white glimpses of burning houses and fleeing men. That Battle of Pima Butte was not perfectly preserved in official reports and army maps. It comes to us in fragments, a mail writer's journal, newspaper rumors, government letters, Pima calendar sticks, old men remembering what they saw as children, and tribal traditions carried across decades. Put together, those fragments tell one unmistakable story: a dawn raid that turned into annihilation in the Arizona desert, and one of the last great native against native battles on the North American frontier. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the Battle of Pima Butte. If you did, please give a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you get your podcast, please leave a 5-star rating. All of this really helps me grow and reach new listeners. Leave a comment down below if you'd like me to post audio only for both the Bass Reeves and Joe Meek series. Join the membership family. For just $1 a month, you'll get access to bonus episodes like the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. Thank you for all the amazing support, and a special thank you to the membership family. Y'all are amazing. We'll see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.